Welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm joined by returning guest Robert Bryce, accomplished writer, Substacker, author of 5 books, film
Six. Now
producer.
don't shortchange me here right at the beginning, Keever. 6 books. Come on now.
That's why the self-introductions are better, Robert. You taught me that. But you've been on so long, and I think there's enough of a crossover in our listenership. You can keep it ultra brief, but I'll do what you do to your guests to you. Take a moment, Robert. Introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Well, first, glad to be back. Dr. Kiefer, always a pleasure to see you and talk to you. I live in Austin, Texas. I'm the proud father of 3 kids, Mary, Michael, and Jacob. Proud husband to my wife, Lauren. Bryce, we've been together 40 years. She's an amazing woman, artist, photographer, teacher. I live a charmed life. I report on and write about the energy and power sectors and do my best to report on it honestly and frequently. How's that?
Absolutely frequently. I can attest to that as someone who follows your work very closely. In our pre-chat, you were saying you took a weekend off. It sounds like that's the exception to the rule. Pretty busy on the speaking circuit as well, I understand.
Yes, I'm very fortunate that way. I'm booked already. We're in February. I've got 11 paid engagements already on the calendar this year. I'm going to speak at SMU with our friends Mark Nelson and Maddie Hilley. We're doing a panel at the Southern Methodist University next week on resurgence in nuclear power, kind of the younger generation embrace of nuclear in America.
We'll have to get you up to Canada one of these days soon. So, Robert, the reason I wanted to have you on, you published a very interesting investigative piece on your Substack recently. Everyone should go and head over there and subscribe. I understand you moved from MailChimp over to Substack, and you found that to be a good fit. But yeah, this piece, I was very impressed. Very thorough investigative journalism. Don't see a lot of that, particularly on Substack. And the title was "The Billionaires Behind the Gas Ban." And you have charted the story of a brand new foundation, the Climate Imperative Foundation, and you've looked at some of the numbers behind the forces arrayed on this kind of energy transition battle of ideas. And I hadn't seen a lot of that. I hadn't seen a lot of precise figures put to this. I've often talked about the kind of David and Goliath battle between this group of merry men and women, kind of Robin Hoods of nuclear energy advocacy up against some very large and well-established environmental NGOs who make it their calling to score own goals on themselves on the climate front. But wanted to have you on to discuss this article. So can you tell me how the genesis of it? I mean, I
Sure.
thought this had come together quite quickly, but I think you've been working on this for some time.
No, I actually been collecting string on. I collect string on a lot of different topics, and I put them in a folder. Or I'll draft part of an article, and then I'll set it aside. I'm hoping to get one out tomorrow on high voltage transmission, which is an issue I've written about many times, but I'm going to put it on Substack. But I've been collecting string on it for years. This article, "The Billionaires Behind the Gas Bans," which is on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. I first noticed this group, Climate Imperative, in an article, very short piece that was published on Axios, and then it was carried in Yahoo. That just kind of this casual mention of there's this new group called Climate Imperative, and they have a budget of $1 billion over 5 years. And I read that, and then I read it again, and I read it again. I thought, $1 billion over 5 years? That's my math is the divisions here pretty simple. That's $200 million a year. Out of the gate, this group is going to be bigger than the Sierra Club and almost as big as the American Petroleum Institute, which is on the other side of the issue here. But API has been around for over 100 years. So, I mean, I looked at the staggering amount of money that this group was getting. And I emailed them, well, can you tell me? Oh, no, we're not doing interviews, right? And so it was like from the beginning, the effort by this group and the 2 key people who are the founders, Marianne Hitt and Bruce Nilles, were at the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club was spending most of the money coming from Michael Bloomberg for their Beyond Coal. What was started their Beyond Coal campaign became their Beyond Carbon campaign. But what intrigued me as well was, okay, so here's Michael Bloomberg giving $500 million to the Sierra Club. And here's the Climate Imperative apparently getting a vast amount of their money from Laurene Powell Jobs and John Doerr, 2 billionaires. But they wouldn't answer the question about nuclear because I thought, well, if you're serious about climate, as you know, and Chris, we've talked about this many times. If you're anti-carbon dioxide and anti-nuclear, you're pro-blackout. Well, I'm anti-blackout. I've been pro-nuclear for more than a decade, more than saying the same things for 13 years. But they wouldn't answer even that question about, well, are you pro-nuclear? So I thought, well, this is truly screwed up, right? That here's a group that's operating with in clearly trying to keep their intentions secret. What they're operating, why wouldn't they be more open? And to a reporter like me, why are they hiding? So anyway, that's a very long introduction to why I finally published the piece, because it was timely then after all these headlines around the gas bans. And one of the punchlines is that you look at these top 5 anti-hydrocarbon, anti-nuclear NGOs, Climate Imperative, NRDC, Sierra Club, Rocky Mountain Institute, Environmental Defense Fund. They're spending on the order of $1.5 billion a year. That's 3 times.
That's something I wanted to clarify, because I mean, these are enormous numbers. So they have an endowment, I guess. They've got money in the bank. And what you're, just to be very particular here, when you say they're spending, on the order of 200 million a year, I think the term is annual gross receipts. This is money spent.
Well, okay, so this is the part where it gets a little tricky, and I'll be honest that these numbers may be somewhat higher, may be somewhat lower, but GuideStar, which is the entity that tracks the nonprofits in the U.S., publishes what they call their gross receipts number. So this would be as the closest comparable to annual revenue. So when I say they're spending that, yes, I mean that's one of the rules with nonprofits. You have to spend what you take. You don't have to spend every dime, but you're not allowed to just lay this money around. You've got to put it to work, right? And so this is part of the thing that is key. I looked up, in fact, how this law firm, how they define gross receipts. It's the number that is the total amount an organization earns per year from all sources without subtracting any expenses. So it's comparable to revenue, but it's the nonprofit number. So this is just a staggering number, and compared to the top 5 NGOs that are pro-hydrocarbon, pro-nuclear, so NEI, Western States Petroleum, Society of Petroleum Engineers, American Gas Association, API, their revenue is roughly $500 million. So just the top 5 groups, if you compare them side by side, it's a 3-to-1 cost differential. And the part that to me is so important here, Dr. Kiefer, is that forever the left has been saying, oh, the Koch brothers, Exxon, they've got so much money and they're thwarting our traction on climate. It's just the exact opposite. That the pro-hydrocarbon groups are so far outspent, it's not even close.
Well, I think what's even more interesting there is, certainly prior to digging into this myself, there's Greenpeace, for instance, they're always out fundraising. They're beating down my door a few times a year, certainly asking for donations. And I think as a result, the lay public would assume that these organizations are funded in a grassroots manner. Certainly, movements on the left side of the political spectrum like to think of themselves that way. I mean, Bernie Sanders, I think, did a pretty good job of having, all kind of small donations running that campaign, and that had an impact on the kind of messaging he was able to bring forth. Not all of which I agree with, but I think this is very interesting because you looked into who the key funders were with the Climate Imperative Foundation. Can you tell me a little bit about those individuals? I mean, how many people are we talking about behind this movement? How organic is it?
Well, that's the key question as well, is that it appears that nearly all of their money is coming from 2 sources, which is John Doerr, who's a billionaire based in Silicon Valley, a venture capitalist, and Laurene Powell Jobs, who is Steve Jobs' widow. Together, if memory serves, their net worth, according to Forbes, is something combined is something on the order of $30 billion. So these aren't just the elites; these are the super elites. Yeah, Forbes estimates Doerr's net worth at 12.7 or 13 billion. Forbes put Powell Jobs' net worth at 17.7 billion. Well, the other people who are on the board of the Climate Imperative, I've never heard of any of them, and none of them appear on Forbes' list of the richest people in America. So, and people that I know and are familiar with the funding on this group said the money's coming from Doerr and Jobs. Well, here's the part that just grinds my gears, as my late brother John Bryce said, grills my cheese. These are the super elites, right? And as well as I want to talk about Jeff Bezos, who's giving money to the NRDC and Rocky Mountain Institute, and Bloomberg, who owns 12 houses and flies on, they fly on jets. They have multiple homes all over the world. But Laureen Powell Jobs, she flies around in a Gulfstream G650 that burns 500 gallons of jet fuel per hour. And yet these are the people, the billionaires, who are funding the groups who say you can't use natural gas in your home because it's a threat to the climate. I mean, I think it's an outrageous example of how the super elites, the super mobile super elites are telling essentially the poor and the middle class, no, you may not. You may not use natural gas. Never mind that it's the last form of affordable in-home energy that you can access. You are going to be required to electrify your home. It's not a beneficial electrification. It's forced electrification, even though the Department of Energy's own numbers show that requiring people to use electricity in their homes for home heating in the U.S. in October, they printed this number, 46% more expensive. I mean, there's just... It reminds me of what Joel Kotkin says. This is about class. I mean, this is fundamentally a class issue.
I guess before we get into that question of, can the grid even handle that degree of electrification? You've had Jennifer Hernandez on a number of times. She's, I believe, launching a class action lawsuit regarding some of the climate policies in California on the basis of class discrimination, essentially. Can you walk us through a little bit of that angle? You've touched on it now, but in terms of the impact that these policies have on, poor and racialized people.
Well, I think that the regressive nature of nearly all of these climate policies, and I say that as a blanket statement, but I don't see anything that contradicts that point. When you look at electric vehicle mandates, who buys electric vehicles today? Yes, some of them are coming down in price, but that's the Benz and Beamer crowd. In the U.S., the average household income for an EV buyer is on the order of $140,000 a year. That's the median household income. That's twice the U.S. average. So it's not the working class that are buying these luxury sports cars, and that's exactly what they are, as generally speaking. But when you look at more fundamentally about in the home, and this is one thing where I look at this from a historical basis, what was the push for rural electrification in America? And I can't speak to Canada, but in America, it was really, a few members of Congress and the Senate who had been born in rural America. Sam Rayburn was born in Bottom, Texas, in rural poverty. Lyndon Johnson, who got to Washington after the Rural Electrification Act had passed in 1930, he arrived in 37. But Burton Wheeler, George Norris, they were motivated from rural electrification because they saw rural women struggling to make it. Right? They were having to haul water. They were having to cook with wood stoves. Electricity freed these women, and having cheap, abundant, reliable power freed them from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. Okay, but it allowed them more freedom in the home. But this move that's afoot now, it's going to restrict women's ability to use the cheapest fuel to dry their clothes, heat their water, and cook their food, and heat their home. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong. And it's further, I think it's dangerous from just a pure energy security standpoint. That, and relying on one network that can't even handle the load that's on it now, and they're saying, oh, we're going to put even more load on it. That's just, I don't want to get too crazy, too technical here. That's crazy town.
Yeah, I mean, and there's very real consequences as you lived during the Texas blackouts. Was that last February or the February before?
2 Februaries ago. But remember, I'm in Austin, and just this morning I looked, there's still 27,000 people in Austin today who don't have power because the distribution system here got slammed by the ice storm. So this wasn't in Winter Storm Uri, that was a generation problem. These blackouts here in Austin are a distribution problem. But still, both instances underscore the fragility of the electric grid. And so the idea that we should put all of our energy, make our most important sources of energy dependent on one network, well, that's just foolish. We need diversity in our fuel supply. And I recognize the issue of climate change, and climate change is a concern, but it's not our only concern. We have to balance it against the issue of energy security and affordability.
Well, it's interesting where electric heat has been economical. And that certainly hasn't been by following, an Amory Lovin's soft path approach or by feed-in tariffs for wealthy homeowners to put solar panels on their roofs. I mean, these are massive infrastructure projects, like in, my neighboring province in Quebec, the James Bay Hydro project, which built enough, low cost. It was a high capital investment, certainly, but low cost hydro but they heat that province with electricity, or the French nuclear build out, where much of their heating is electrified. But I always say, if you want to electrify everything, you better be damn sure that that electricity generation is ultra reliable. Um,
Exactly.
and you've done a lot of work looking into the increasing fragility of the grid. I believe you're making a film on that topic.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about some of the findings, and some of the trends towards unreliability of the U.S. electric grid.
Well, I think all you need to do is look at California. I mean, this is the poster child for what not to do, where it's a state where Generac, the standby generator company, they see California as their big growth market. They also see it as Texas. And so you have California, you can look on PG&E's website, or they have blackouts across the state daily. I mean, it's not a sometime occurrence. It's an everyday occurrence in the state. We were there last summer shooting interviews, and we talked to a guy, these new developments that are being put in with high rises or condos, they're automatically putting in a standby generator. I mean, it's as a matter of course, because they recognize the unreliability of the California grid. And further, you can look at the number of standby generator permits, the permits for these standby generators in and around the Bay Area. They've skyrocketed. So, people aren't, consumers are not stupid. They're going to make sure that they protect themselves if they can afford it. But again, Chris, this takes us back to the class issue. I don't have a standby generator. I know a lot of people, people I'm acquainted with who have them, but they've spent 20 grand on this or more, 20, 30, 40 grand. The people who are rich can afford to have that backup system for their home, but not the kids in the barrio, the working class, people who are working at Starbucks. They're not able to afford that. They're renters. They don't have solar panels. They don't have Teslas. They're just barely scraping by. So again, the whole of this issue is about class and the fact that these billionaires are the ones that are pushing this class divide and prohibiting the use very carefully and very lavishly funding these campaigns to prohibit the use of natural gas. I think it's just flat wrong.
I'm reminded of Marie Antoinette's line of let them eat cake.
Sure.
But let's talk a little bit about the sort of climate aristocracy's impact on policymaking. There's phrase about the nonprofit industrial complex in the United States. I understand that there's a certain amount of tax avoidance benefits to starting large foundations. So do you have any sense of the overall scale of the nonprofit industrial complex, but I guess even more interestingly, how that integrates into the political process? Famously, Gina McCarthy of the Natural Resources Defense Council was, I believe, climate envoy for Joe Biden. How does this sector interact with the political space and exert its influence over policy?
Well, that's a really good, I like that line, the climate aristocracy. I'm going to steal it. But I'm working on another Substack that I'll publish in the next week or two on the anti-industry industry. And this is what the U.S. and you helped me with some numbers or just pointing me to some outfits in Canada where you have a different tax structure for these kind of entities. And in fact, I looked them up. I've been making spreadsheets. I'm all about spreadsheets. I'm collecting them all the time. But you're in Canada, you have the David Suzuki Foundation, Sierra Club Canada, Greenpeace Canada, Toronto Atmospheric Fund, Environmental Defense Canada. Their budgets are just tiny compared to these similar NGOs in the United States. Those five, according to the numbers that I just downloaded just the other day, $33 million total. That's 33 million Canadian. Well, in your cute little Canadian dollars, it's not worth as much as we translate the US dollars. You're talking about 25 million. Now you compare that to the numbers I've already given you on those top five, Climate Works, environment. I mean, look at and Climate Imperative Foundation by itself is 10 times larger, $221 million. I mean, it's staggering the scale of this. And to your point about this NGO industrial complex, NGO and climate corporate industrial complex, or that's the term that I've coined about it, there's a revolving door between these groups, the NRDC, academia, government, back into academia or back into the NGOs or into industry. And it's as my friend Chuck Spinney put it, he calls it the self-licking ice cream cone, right? That you have these tightly networked people who have these same kind of networks of influence that they go into government, they come out of government, they go back, And this is part of the way Washington now works. But the numbers that I'm collecting for this piece on the anti-industry industry, you look at the top 20 or so NGOs that are involved in climate advocacy that I would typify as anti-hydrocarbon and anti-nuclear, their budgets, their annual revenues exceed $4 billion a year. It's just a massive amount of money.
And I mean, so this is spending, I think what we think of as billboards and campaigns. But I mean, this money is going into, large number of employees, into, developing those human resources, into creating functionaries, into building a whole professional managerial class. It's funny. I mean, you mentioned the even population adjusted, the impact of these organizations. I shouldn't say the impact. The funding of these organizations is much lower in Canada, but our prime minister, his chief of staff, his members of his prime minister's office, several of them are from the World Wildlife Fund, and they've certainly been a pulling our federal government away from nuclear energy, for instance. It's I think the kind of more, I don't want to say deep state impacts, but if your staffer, gained their experience and their reputation, I guess I'm curious about the sort of mechanisms by which, more not so much the campaigning, but the human resources that are developed and then work their way into the political process. Often not as the candidate, but as the key staffers of their office. I think that's a really subtle kind of policy impact, but a really important one with huge implications.
Yeah, and maybe it's not subtle. I mean, maybe it's really quite, in fact, overt in that it's clear how this revolving door works. But I think it's also indicative as I look at when I look at where are these entities based, these ENGOs that we've been discussing, San Francisco, New York, Washington, San Francisco, Boston, San Francisco, Oakland, Washington. None of them are in Des Moines. None of them are in Waco, Texas, right? None of them are in, the middle of the country. These are, in fact, the coastal elites. And who do they care about? Well, they care about the coastal elites, right? They are insulated from the people who I respect and I want to represent. And who are those people? The people who turn wrenches. I've thought about this a lot. Who are my people? I'm for the people who fix cars and make them run and drive buses and work, have to be, who aren't in the keyboard economy, as Jennifer Hernandez says. But they get no these people don't know this professional managerial class that you point out. It's critically important because they're not accountable, right? And in fact, this is something I think we chatted about the other day, and that's offline, but this is an asymmetric fight, Chris, in that these policy groups, for a win for them is they go to the Berkeley City Council and say, you should ban natural gas. And the city councilors in Berkeley say, hey, that's a really good idea. We're going to ban natural gas. And so for them, that's a win. That little policy move is a win that they can then use to get more funding. But therein lies the problem, is that the companies and entities that have to provide electrons and molecules, they have to continue providing electrons and molecules no matter what happens. And yet these policy groups, all they have to do is pass policy. Well, that's a much easier lift than actually providing gas in the home or providing electricity. So it's not a fair fight. And I don't use fair, it's asymmetric, I guess, is the better way to think. It's an asymmetric fight. And the traditional energy producers are getting their butts kicked. I mean, they're getting beat so bad. I'm not going to say it's entertaining to watch. It's rather horrifying to watch because they've been so completely back-footed and they don't realize how badly outgunned and outmanned they are.
So, in terms of the political actions that groups like the Climate Imperative Foundation are working for, they're alienating the people, essentially, a working class base by fighting for policies which make life frankly unaffordable. What are the sort of mechanisms at place? I mean, it strikes me that this is hyper elite, engaging with an elite level of politics, not grassroots in any way. We've heard a lot about, gas stove bans, electric vehicle mandates. These are all potentially nice things if you can afford them. But you hear a lot about, the sort of economic refugees leaving California because it's unaffordable. Tell me a little bit about the policy proposals that are being generated and supported by some of these environmental NGOs.
Sure. Well, I wrote about it in the piece on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, on the billionaires behind the gas bans. Doomberg said, promote the Substack. So I'm doing, Doomberg told me, I'm doing what Doomberg told me. He said, hype the Substack. So Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. But in California alone, the Sierra Club and Rocky Mountain Institute on their website, the Sierra Club lists them. There are over 60 communities now in California that have banned the use of gas in future homes and businesses. They will implement a statewide ban, beginning, I believe, in 2030 on new appliances in the home. We've seen similar bans in New York City. In Seattle, there was an effort to push one statewide in New York that I think has been stalled for the moment. A similar move afoot in Massachusetts, where I think the state is going to allow 10 communities to implement these gas bans. So, I'll argue with you on the grassroots part of this, because here's the thing that I think is one of the things that's so insidious about this is that Climate Imperative and the Sierra Club and Rocky Mountain Institute, they're helping fund local community groups to push these bans. And the appearance, of course, is that, these are local activists who are climate activists, and they're on the front lines here, and we're going to implement a gas ban because of climate change. Never mind that cooking with gas in the United States, it represents 0.4% of total gas consumption in the United States. It's insignificant in terms of the overall story. But I think that there is this cloak, this secretive and interconnected campaigns that are afoot here. These massive foundations with hundreds of millions of dollars are funding local community, local activists to push these policies. And so it looks like it's all locally generated, but the money is actually it's a lot of it. I will use the word dark money, the phrase dark money, because I think that's what it is. They are purposely concealing the interconnected nature of these campaigns and making it look like they're local grassroots, when in fact their money is coming from these big multinational, or these big NGOs that are getting funding from some of the richest people in the world.
Yeah, no, it's incredible, working in this bizarre space of nuclear advocacy and just the absolute penny pinching that's required, the DIY nature of our, graphic design and our little pamphlets that we're making on our spare time. It has a big impact having a kind of mother organization that's able to help you organize, that's able to provide you with, graphic design templates, even just pay your print shop bills. This is potentially very impactful. At the same time, it is interesting.
And I'll say
Yeah.
that it gives you a different kind of credibility in the marketplace of ideas, that they can't, they can try to attack you and say, oh, well, where's your funding coming from? You say, well, here, look, that's me, or, but there's a level of credibility here that's important. But I think it's also important to see how the media has responded. And the media immediately, and I say this legacy media, where Rocky Mountain Institute puts out this flimsy study, not even worth the paper it's printed on, claiming 12% of all asthma in the United States is due to gas stoves. And the Washington Post prints it as though it's fact. And then you have this big kerfuffle, and then RMI immediately walks it back and says, we're not claiming causality here. Well, wait a minute. What are you doing? But they are the difference, and I think it's a similarity in terms of the gas ban issues and the nuclear issues that you're fighting, is that the media outlets, the legacy media outlets, are far more disposed to report the story according to the narrative being promoted by these NGOs than they are than the entities that are pushing traditional forms of energy or nuclear.
Yeah, it's interesting when people claim a certain percentage behind a malady. The numbers often don't add up, because you start getting into the 500% range once you try and tally in every variable people are bringing into it. I want to talk a little bit about, the blowback from this. Is this potential blowback? Is the blowback already happening in terms of, the affordability crisis and the ways in which these policies are frankly out of step with the needs of the majority of Americans? We talked a bit about Jennifer Hernandez and that class action lawsuit. How is this being felt? Because even, if you are sincere in your climate concern, alienating the majority of your population is not going to help your cause in the long term. So what sort of things are we seeing developing in terms of blowback here?
Well, it's very much partisan, and I'll just add one quick point there. And the litigation that Jennifer has filed on the behalf of the 200, which is a coalition of Latino groups in California, I don't think they're seeking class action. They're class status in federal court. They're merely pursuing this on behalf of their their plaintiffs and the Latino plaintiffs that they represent. So I don't think it's a class certification they're after, but they have sued over the air quality, over the climate impact issues, and also the mandates over electric vehicles. But as far as, jumping back to the gas ban issue, to me, what was fascinating, well, several things were fascinating about it. One was once this came out and there was, claims that the Consumer Product Safety Commission was going to ban gas stoves, the Biden administration, the White House immediately said, oh, the president is not in favor of banning gas stoves. Because I think they saw it and realized, wait a minute, we're going to alienate a lot of people if we push this policy, because a lot of people like to cook with gas, right? There are 47 million American homes, roughly, well, not quite half, something like 40% of American homes, people cook with gas. In California, 80% of California homes heat with gas. So there is very much a realization by politicians on both sides that they have to be careful here. And so you've seen the Democratic politicians trying to walk it back, where the Republicans are trying to push this and say, see, we told you. And there's a part of this too that I think, Chris, is really important to note, which is and I say this as a nonpartisan, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm disgusted, but that the Democratic Party has become the party of the elites, and the Republicans are increasingly the party of the working class. And there's a very, very good article in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago talking about this very thing by Gerald Baker, talking about this very thing. Something like 60 or 65% of white, non-college educated males vote Republican now. That the group that you would think would be the union members that would be voting Democrat. No. They've become Republicans because the Republicans are speaking up more on working class issues. And the gas stove issue is one that they can point to and say, see, these are the elites that are pushing this kind of policy that's going to hurt you and your affordability of, your ability to pay your bills. And even your liberty. I mean, liberty in the kitchen, right? What fuel you're going to be allowed to use, goes to. I mean, I don't beat that drum very often but there is something about this idea of what you're going to be allowed to use.
No, I mean, definitely. I think there's a great piece by Roy Teixeira as well about the 5 deadly sins of the left, and when you understand the kind of abandonment of the factory floor. Which used to be the organizing place for labor type political parties, and that transition into academia, it's really no surprise that that's becoming untethered, and really untethered in a durable fashion. This isn't just political loyalty shifting on one election cycle, but this is potentially very significant in terms of those realignments. I mean, I shake my head and I can't tell who's left and who's right anymore based upon where they were 40 years ago. When it comes to these these political parties,
and that's one of Joel Kotkin's points, right? That the battle isn't so much left right; it's top versus bottom, right? That it is a class divide, and I see it as, yes, I think it's class, but I think it's also urban rural as well, and that what you have, why are all these NGOs we talked about? They're 20 some odd with budgets of $4 billion a year. Where are they located? They're not in rural America. They're not in the center part of the country. That's flyover country for them. So the divide, particularly when it comes to issues around renewables, right, which is the other big part of this whole discussion, and high voltage transmission, it's, we're going to force these local communities to take projects that they don't want. And you've seen the dynamics of this, of course, in Canada and in Ontario, where you have major pushback from small communities across Ontario saying, we don't want these wind projects. But that urban rural and the class divide, that I think is something very worrisome I see in the United States, and something that I don't see being resolved anytime soon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and there's also this issue. I mean, I'm glad you brought up rural electrification. The Tennessee Valley Authority building massive pieces of infrastructure. If you were serious about an electrify everything agenda, you would need to be creating sources of very cheap, abundant, affordable power, and I just don't see that, and so it feels like there's this kind of game of chicken being played by politicians making commitments, for instance, for internal combustion engine phase outs, for electrification, when the generation's simply not going to be there, and it's already showing signs of fragilizing, and I don't know how much longer those commitments can be made. Do you think X is going to happen by 2030? Is just going to be endlessly put off further into the future, or do you think there's a moment of reckoning, when these promises speed into the wall at 100 kilometers an hour and there's an impact?
Hey, that's a good question, Chris. I don't think it's going to be that, this cataclysmic like we could see a massive grid failure, right? And we saw, big failures of the grid earlier in January when we had that big cold snap around, or rather in Christmas time. But the way I see it is, if you look at the politicians that are in office now, they can say, well, we're going to do this by 2030. They're not going to be around when 2030 rolls around, right? So it's easy for them to say, we're going to push this policy, but they're not the ones that are going to be the ones that have to implement it. And further, I think that it's, from a simple macro political standpoint, they could say, look, we pushed this. The utilities didn't do it. Those damn utilities, they pushed back, right? Blame them, right? And that's what we see over and over. Look at what's the worst job in America? Maybe the CEO of Pacific Gas and Electric, right? They're like, oh, you're required to electrify everything, and you can spend your money in one of three different ways. You can spend it trying to fireproof your distribution and transmission system. You can spend it on renewables, or you can spend it on expanding the transmission network. And you're the CEO, and they're going to trial for manslaughter in California. Where would you spend your money? It would be on making sure you don't cause any more stupid fires, right? But here's a company that's gone bankrupt twice in 20 years. And so, the utility is always the easy scapegoat for any of these problems. So I think it's, from a simple political calculus, it's easy to, pound the table and, to, make platitudes around these issues. But the politicians aren't the ones that are going to have to implement it. They can blame someone else for not doing so.
I mean, the other brick wall that's being sped into, by these organizations, which are, I assume, very pro-renewable. I want to chat with you a bit more about, any of the other campaigns or themes that, groups like the Climate Imperative in particular, since it's such a new organization, are pushing for. But that recent report by Siemens Gamesa, Europe's largest wind turbine manufacturer, I mean, no new orders for offshore wind in the last quarter, and prices rising 40%. I mean, are we seeing the momentum of renewables deployments slowing down? And, to what degree are these organizations going to be able to, push for policies of increasing subsidy to make up for that, to keep the whole Rube Goldberg-Sheen deployments on schedule?
Well, that's a really good question, and a lot of issues there that are at play. You had Lee Gehring on your podcast a few months ago, and I had his colleague Adam Rosenzweig on the Power Hungry podcast as well. And I think they make a very good point, which is that renewables boomed over the last decade, over a period where we had very low interest rates, or effectively in many cases zero interest rates at zero, and low commodity prices. And now we're not seeing that, right? We're seeing commodity prices go up. We're seeing fragile supply chains largely dependent on China, and we're seeing interest rates skyrocketing. And so here in the U.S., on the eastern seaboard, on the East Coast, you've had numerous offshore wind projects announce, oh, we're going to delay, or we're going to seek a higher power purchase agreement because we can't make money at the deal that we signed just a few months ago because the landscape has changed. So there are a lot of things that are coming together that are affecting the growth in renewables. And of course, one of my issues that I've now been tracking for over a decade, land use, right? That we're seeing, in fact, these constraints on land use and the availability of land for new wind, new solar. Otoe County just was in touch with some people in Otoe County, Nebraska last night. Their county commissioners just implemented a new set of rules that effectively stops the development of a wind project that NextEra was pushing called Panama Wind. So you add in the constraints on high voltage transmission, you add in all these other issues around, the availability of turbines. There are many things that are creating more friction for renewables. And what I hope, and I know you do as well, is that this accrues to the benefit of nuclear, and that we'll see a resurgence in nuclear. And I think we are. I think Western Europe is proof of that. Your great work in Canada, synergizing and energizing that the moves by Ontario Power Generation to refurbish Pickering. We're seeing some very positive momentum in that. And I think that, are we at an inflection point? I'm not going to call it yet, but I think there is a growing realization that all of these factors, including reliance on China, that are coming together, that are taking as a friend of mine said a long time ago, the bloom off the rose of renewables.
In terms of your investigative journalism on these organizations, you mentioned, you can't get interviews and chat with them. You've got limited tools.
They're not accountable. They don't. They're
Yeah.
only going to talk to people that are friendly to them, and then aren't going to ask them any hard questions. And there's the big media outlets aren't really looking at them. I was looking at the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation last night. Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They've been funding the NRDC since the 80s. I mean, the Rockefellers funding this anti-nuclear, anti-hydrocarbon group that effectively shut down Indian Point. These people are guilty of being, committing terrible climate policy and with no accountability, no understanding of what is actually happening. And it grinds my gears.
Because I mean, the numbers are shocking; they're very large. But I mean, I hope maybe yourself or other investigative journalists are going to be able to unpack a little bit again about exactly how it's being spent. We mentioned sort of the development of this professional managerial class, which I think has an outsized influence on politics. My group, in terms of making our case, we have history to point to. We have the massive candor deployment. Here in Canada and France, they can reference actual, historical build-outs that have occurred, proven decarbonization efforts. But so much of what the popular discourse hinges on these days are things like modeling studies, which are frankly, out of the affordability of organizations like myself to pay for. So it'd be interesting, again, just to understand, more of how this money is spent, how it circulates. Do you have any hope that work even can be done?
Well, I just found this one clip because I've been doing my homework on the anti-industry industry, and I'll just read you this one. This is from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund website. I'm quoting. In the 1970s, the fund began supporting the environmental law movement through grants to the Natural Resources Defense Council. Lawrence's son, Lawrence Rockefeller, attorney Lawrence Rockefeller Jr., worked at NRDC for over 25 years and continues to serve as an NRDC trustee in 2016. So, the amount of the media money and momentum is behind these anti-hydrocarbon, anti-nuclear groups. I mean, the media is fully behind them. I mean, they're unquestioning, like we saw in the gas stove article. Is there some counter movement? Yes, there is. And, your work is a clear example of this. Clear Path, Breakthrough, I'd say Third Way, relatively small think tanks in the United States compared to these other big NGOs that are making some headway. And we're seeing some progress with Congress in providing new subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act of $30 billion or so. So there is some progress, but let's make no mistake, Chris. I mean, the battle here against these moneyed interests, and it is big money. I mean, massive amounts of money, where you have big law firms, Wall Street firms, Wall Street big investment banks, JP Morgan funding or, doing billions of dollars with NextEra Energy, the big NGOs, and then the corporate interests, many of them foreign, including Swedish firms trying to force a solar project in Cambria, New York. I mean, there's just an incredible amount at stake here, billions of dollars at stake. Let's make no mistake. And so these entities that have the money, they have the natural advantage because they have so much money and they have the sympathy of the media.
I'm going to have to wrap up pretty shortly because I've got to get off to work soon to that other job I do. But I did want to give you a chance, Robert.
You saving lives and all the rest of it, Kiefer. Saving people from dying in the emergency room.
Making me blush here. But you mentioned the Substack project. And I think we've flirted at talking about the film that's I think going to be coming out this year. I think it's topical. How much can you give us in terms of you don't have a trailer for us here we can send, but in terms of a sneak preview of what's to come?
Sure. Well, thank you. Just a little bit of background. So yes, I've written 6 books. I did a documentary with my colleague Tyson Culver called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World, that came out a couple years ago. Very proud of that documentary. And but it was really hard to make. And I thought I was done with making documentaries. I thought, it's just too much friction. It costs too much. But I'm called to make this film, and it's called Burning Down the Grid. And what is the film going to do? We're going to tell the human story of the electric grid, how it got Enroned, and what we must do to fix it. And it got Enron with a lot of bad policy, a lot of bad money, that much of the roots of that came out of the Enron Corporation, the failure of Enron. But that policy still lives on, both here in Texas, California, the UK. Enron was very active in all of those places. And then what we must do to fix it, we have to have more robust government intervention. We have to have nuclear power. We can argue about climate change. We're not arguing climate change in this film. we're saying if we're serious about affordability, resilience, and reliability, we have to go nuclear. We have to go nuclear in a big way. And we're proud that you're going to be in the film. The Canadian story is an integral part of this story. Interviewed some of the people we've already talked about, Maddie Healy among them, Emmett Penny. I'm very hopeful about nuclear. Am I clear-eyed about the challenges? Damn right. There are a lot of challenges yet, but this is a film that I'm called to make, and Tyson's been doing a great job, and we've been very successful in raising the money for it, and we're going to make it happen, and planning to have it out by second quarter of this year, and maybe we'll come up in Toronto and do a screening up there.
Well, I certainly look forward to that, Robert. It'd be great to see you in person again. Thanks again for making the time and for doing what you do. This is a really valuable contribution. Certainly putting some numbers on this, and as I said, I'm really excited about the possibility of more investigative journalism. Someone even writing a book again, if they were able to get to sneak behind the curtain and see how this money is spent, what those mechanisms are. I think it's a fascinating topic. Thanks again, Robert. I hope you don't get blacked out again by this ice storm and the transmission issues. I know that was a traumatic experience for you a couple of years ago, but also formative.
But I lived through it, and it provided a lot of the motivation for what I'm doing now, Chris. So, but same back to you. I'm a big fan, and always love being on the Decoupled podcast. So, tell everybody about robertbryce.substack.com. Doomberg told me to remind them. But also, if you want to look at, I've updated the renewable rejection database. It's on my website, robertbryce.com. It's now searchable by keyword, by year, by state. So I put a lot of effort and a fair amount of my own money in getting that updated with our mutual friend Brian Gitt. So that's new and is up and ready to go as well. So I'm working as hard as I can, my friend, but I know you are as well. So look forward to talking more.
All right, wonderful. Take care, Robert.